The windswept landscapes of northern Scotland hold secrets buried beneath centuries of peat and stone, where the remnants of hill forts crown ancient summits and carved stones bear witness to a civilization that once dominated the Highlands. Archaeological excavations across Pictish territories have revealed a complex tapestry of Iron Age settlements that flourished long before Roman sandals ever touched Scottish soil. These discoveries paint a picture of sophisticated communities that had already established themselves across the rugged terrain from the Forth to the Northern Islands by the 3rd century CE. Excavations at sites like Burghead in Moray have uncovered massive defensive earthworks dating to the Late Iron Age, with timber-laced ramparts stretching over 100 metres in length. The construction techniques employed here demonstrate remarkable engineering prowess, with interlocking wooden beams reinforcing stone walls in a method that would later be refined during the height of Pictish power. Within these fortified enclosures, archaeologists have discovered evidence of metalworking, including iron slag and bronze-working debris, alongside imported Roman glass beads and pottery fragments that speak to extensive trade networks reaching far beyond the Highland boundaries. The material culture emerging from these early settlements reveals communities with sophisticated artistic traditions and complex social hierarchies. At Rhynie in Aberdeenshire, excavations have yielded elaborate metalwork, including penannular brooches decorated with intricate spiral patterns and zoomorphic designs that would become hallmarks of Pictish artistic expression. The quality of craftsmanship evident in these artefacts suggests the presence of specialised artisans working within a stratified society, where status could be displayed through personal ornamentation and weaponry. Hill fort complexes like those at Tap O'Noath and Mither Tap demonstrate the territorial organisation that characterised pre-Roman northern Scotland. These elevated strongholds commanded strategic positions overlooking river valleys and coastal approaches, their placement indicating a landscape divided among competing chieftains who maintained control through both defensive architecture and displays of wealth. The discovery of rotary querns, iron tools and storage pits within these sites reveals agricultural communities capable of supporting substantial populations through the harsh Highland winters. Perhaps most intriguingly, archaeological evidence suggests these early Pictish communities maintained connections with their southern neighbours while developing distinctly regional characteristics. Roman manufactured goods appear consistently in Iron Age contexts throughout Pictish territories, but they are often modified or incorporated into local artistic traditions in ways that demonstrate cultural adaptation rather than simple adoption. Bronze mirrors found at sites like Balmashanna bear Celtic decorative motifs executed with technical skill that rivals contemporary Roman craftsmanship, yet their iconographic programs remain distinctly non-Roman in character. The linguistic landscape of early Pictish Scotland presents equally compelling evidence for understanding these northern peoples' origins and cultural affiliations. Place-name analysis across the former Pictish territories reveals layers of linguistic influence that speak to both continuity and change over centuries of occupation. The prefix Pit appears in hundreds of Scottish place names, from Pitlochry to Pittenweem, derived from the Pictish word for portion or share of land. This widespread distribution suggests a common administrative system that organised territory according to Pictish legal and social customs. Inscriptions carved on stone monuments provide tantalising glimpses into the Pictish language itself, though their brevity and specialised contexts limit comprehensive linguistic reconstruction. The Drosten stone at St. Vigians bears one of the longest Pictish inscriptions, reading Drosten ipe Euoretet Forcus, which appears to record names and possibly kinship relationships. Comparative analysis with other Celtic languages suggests that Pictish belonged to the Brittonic branch of Celtic, sharing features with Welsh and Cornish rather than the Goidelic languages of Ireland and Western Scotland. The relationship between Pictish and other Celtic languages remains a subject of scholarly debate, but evidence points to a complex linguistic situation in early medieval Scotland. River names like Deveron, Findhorn and Spey preserve pre-Pictish Celtic elements that may represent the substrate language spoken by earlier inhabitants of the region. Over this foundation, Pictish developed its own distinctive characteristics while maintaining intelligibility with related Brittonic dialects spoken further south. Personal names recorded in later Pictish king lists provide additional linguistic evidence for understanding their cultural connections. Names like Brede, Nechtain and Talogan show clear Celtic etymologies, often with cognates in Welsh and Breton sources. The element tau appears frequently in royal names and likely derives from a Celtic word meaning forehead or front, possibly indicating leadership or prominence. These naming patterns suggest cultural continuities that stretch back to the common Celtic heritage shared across much of Iron Age Britain. Roman writers first encountered the peoples who had become known as Picts during the campaigns of Gnaeus Julius Agricola in the 80s CE, though the term Picti itself would not appear in classical sources until much later. Tacitus, writing in his biography of his father-in-law Agricola, described fierce resistance from northern tribes who employed guerrilla tactics and intimate knowledge of their homeland to frustrate Roman advances. The Battle of Monsgraupius, fought somewhere in northeastern Scotland around 84 CE, saw Agricola's legions face a confederation of Highland warriors under a leader named Calgacus. Tacitus's account, while filtered through Roman literary conventions and propaganda, provides valuable insights into the military capabilities and social organisation of these northern peoples. He describes warriors who fought both on foot and from chariots, employing long swords and small shields, while adorning themselves with distinctive war paint or tattoos. The Roman historian notes their ability to appear and disappear into the Highland landscape, using knowledge of local terrain to conduct raids before melting away into forests and mountains where heavily armoured legionaries could not follow. The withdrawal of Roman forces from Scotland following Agricola's recall marked the beginning of a long period of intermittent conflict between the Empire and the northern tribes. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, provides a more detailed description of the peoples beyond Hadrian's Wall, distinguishing between the Caledoni and the Maati as the two principal confederations. He describes both groups as living in tents, going naked and barefoot, and practicing a form of communal marriage that shocked Roman sensibilities. These classical accounts, while valuable for their contemporary perspective, must be interpreted carefully given their authors' cultural biases and literary purposes. Roman writers consistently portrayed northern British peoples as savage and primitive, a characterization that served imperial propaganda while obscuring the sophisticated societies that archaeological evidence reveals. The emphasis on nudity, for instance, likely reflects Roman incomprehension of Celtic customs regarding ritual nakedness in warfare rather than everyday practice. More reliable are Roman military records and geographical descriptions that provide concrete details about northern British territories and peoples. The Antonine itinerary and other imperial documents record place names and tribal territories that can be correlated with archaeological sites and later historical sources. These administrative records suggest that Roman knowledge of northern Scotland was more extensive than literary sources might indicate, based on intelligence gathered through trade contacts, diplomatic missions and military reconnaissance. The question of Pictish ethnogenesis, how and when the Picts emerged as a distinct people, remains one of the most contentious issues in early Scottish history. Traditional interpretations, heavily influenced by medieval origin legends, portrayed the Picts as foreign invaders who arrived in Scotland from continental Europe or Scandinavia. These theories drew support from supposed physical differences between Picts and other Celtic peoples, as well as from their distinctive artistic traditions and political structures. Modern archaeological and genetic evidence, however, strongly supports theories of indigenous development rather than large-scale migration. Excavations throughout Pictish territories reveal cultural continuity stretching back to the Bronze Age, with gradual evolution rather than sudden replacement characterizing material culture sequences. The hill fort tradition, metalworking techniques, and artistic motifs that would later define Pictish civilization all have deep roots in the Scottish Iron Age, suggesting that the Picts represented the culmination of long-term cultural development rather than foreign intrusion. Genetic studies of ancient DNA from Pictish period burials support this interpretation, showing close relationships between early medieval Scottish populations and their Iron Age predecessors. While some external influence can be detected, particularly from Scandinavian sources in later periods, the fundamental genetic structure of northern Scottish populations remained stable throughout the period of Pictish emergence and expansion. The debate over Pictish origins also involves questions about the relationship between the historical Picts and the Caledonii described by Roman sources. Some scholars argue for direct continuity, viewing Picti as simply a later Roman term for the same peoples Tacitus encountered during Agricola's campaigns. Others suggest that the Pictish Confederation represented a new political formation that emerged in response to Roman pressure, uniting previously separate tribal groups under common leadership and identity. Archaeological evidence from the transition period between the Roman Iron Age and the early historic period supports the latter interpretation. Sites like Rhynie show evidence of increasing political centralization and artistic sophistication during the 4th and 5th centuries, suggesting the emergence of more complex political structures than those described in earlier Roman accounts. The appearance of elaborate symbol stones and high-status metalwork indicates the development of new forms of elite display and territorial marking that would become characteristic of Pictish civilization. The geographical distribution of early Pictish cultural markers also suggests a process of political consolidation during this crucial period. Symbol stones and other distinctively Pictish artefacts appear across a territory stretching from Fife to Caithness, indicating the emergence of shared cultural practices and possibly political allegiances across previously fragmented tribal territories. This expansion of Pictish cultural influence coincides with the Roman withdrawal from northern Britain and may represent a response to the power vacuum left by imperial retreat. Environmental factors also played a crucial role in shaping Pictish development during these formative centuries. Climate data suggests that the late Roman period experienced relatively favourable conditions in northern Scotland, with warmer temperatures and increased precipitation supporting agricultural expansion and population growth. These environmental advantages may have provided the economic foundation necessary for the political and cultural developments that characterized early Pictish civilization. The emergence of the Picts as a distinct people thus appears to result from the convergence of multiple factors during the 4th and 5th centuries CE. Indigenous Celtic populations with deep roots in the Scottish Iron Age responded to changing political circumstances following Roman withdrawal by developing new forms of social organisation and cultural expression. This process of ethnogenesis created a people who would dominate northern and eastern Scotland for the next 4 centuries, leaving behind a rich archaeological legacy that continues to illuminate their remarkable civilization. The consolidation of Pictish identity that characterized the 4th and 5th centuries emerged from centuries of sustained resistance against Roman expansion, a conflict that began with Gnaeus Julius Agricola's ambitious campaigns into Caledonia. When Agricola arrived in Britain as governor in 78 CE, he inherited a province where Roman authority extended only to the Cheviot Hills, beyond which lay territories controlled by fierce tribal confederations who had already demonstrated their capacity for organised resistance. The governor's decision to push northward represented the empire's most determined attempt to subjugate the entirety of Britain, a campaign that would ultimately fail but would fundamentally shape the development of Pictish civilization. Agricola's advance into Scotland followed a carefully planned strategy of simultaneous land and naval operations designed to prevent the northern tribes from using their traditional guerrilla tactics. The 9th Legion Hispana spearheaded the land advance while the Roman fleet conducted reconnaissance missions along the eastern coast, establishing temporary bases and gathering intelligence about tribal movements. Archaeological evidence from marching camps across southern Scotland reveals the systematic nature of this campaign, with fortified positions established at regular intervals to secure supply lines and provide staging areas for further advances. The Roman advance encountered increasingly determined resistance as it penetrated deeper into Highland territory. Tribal warriors employed hit-and-run tactics that exploited their intimate knowledge of local terrain, attacking Roman supply columns in narrow glens before disappearing into forests and moorlands where heavy infantry could not effectively pursue them. These tactics forced Agricola to divide his forces, leaving substantial garrisons to protect his extended supply lines while maintaining sufficient strength for offensive operations. The climactic confrontation came at Mons Gropius, a battle whose precise location remains disputed, but which archaeological evidence suggests occurred somewhere in the Grampian foothills of Aberdeenshire. Tacitus describes a Caledonian army of over 30,000 warriors assembled under the leadership of Calgacus, whose name means swordsman in Gaulish, and may represent a title rather than a personal name. The Roman historian's account portrays a sophisticated military organisation among the northern tribes, with different warrior bands positioned according to their equipment and fighting styles across the slopes of the chosen battlefield. The Caledonian battle formation demonstrated tactical sophistication that contradicted Roman assumptions about barbarian warfare. Charioteers occupied the flat ground at the base of the hill, their vehicles serving as mobile platforms for javelin-armed warriors who could strike at Roman formations before withdrawing to safety. Behind them, ranked infantry armed with long swords and oval shields held the middle slopes, while lightly armed skirmishers occupied the heights where they could rain projectiles down on advancing Romans. This deployment maximised the advantages offered by the chosen terrain, while minimising the impact of Roman heavy infantry and cavalry. The battle itself unfolded as a tactical victory for Roman discipline and equipment, but strategic circumstances prevented Agricola from exploiting his success. Tacitus claims that 10,000 Caledonians fell, while Roman losses numbered only 360, figures that likely reflect literary convention rather than accurate casualty counts. More significant was the aftermath, as surviving Caledonian warriors melted away into the Highland landscape rather than submitting to Roman authority. The Emperor Domitian's recall of Agricola shortly after the battle prevented any follow-up campaigns that might have consolidated Roman gains in northern Scotland. The withdrawal of Roman forces from Scotland marked the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between the Empire and the northern tribes. Rather than attempting further conquest, successive emperors adopted a defensive strategy based on fortified boundaries designed to contain rather than eliminate the threat posed by unconquered peoples. This shift in imperial policy reflected both the military realities demonstrated by Agricola's campaigns and changing priorities within the empire, as resources were redirected to other frontiers. The construction of Hadrian's Wall, beginning in 122 CE, represented the most ambitious defensive project in Roman Britain, stretching 84 miles from Wallsend on the River Tyne to Bowness on Solway. The wall itself stood approximately 15 feet high, with a parapet adding another 6 feet, constructed of dressed stone in its eastern sections and turf in the west. 16 major forts housed auxiliary units totalling around 9,000 troops, while smaller mile castles and turrets provided observation points and sally ports for patrols. The scale of this construction project required the labour of all 3 legions stationed in Britain over a period of 6 years, representing an enormous investment in defensive architecture. The wall's design reflected hard-won knowledge about the nature of the northern threat. Rather than simply blocking movement, The barrier was intended to control and monitor cross-border traffic while providing a secure base for offensive operations when circumstances required. The military way running behind the wall allowed rapid movement of troops to threatened sectors, while the vallum earthwork to the south created a secure zone for military installations and supply depots. This sophisticated defensive system acknowledged that complete prevention of northern raids was impossible, while establishing the infrastructure necessary to respond effectively to incursions. Archaeological evidence from Hadrian's Wall reveals the daily realities of frontier warfare during the 2nd century. Inscriptions record units drawn from across the empire, including Germanic, Gallic, and Dacian auxiliaries whose diverse military traditions were adapted to local conditions. Leather documents preserved at Vindolanda provide intimate details of garrison life, including requests for warm clothing, reports of attacks by Bretunculi, and intelligence about northern tribal movements. These sources paint a picture of low-intensity conflict punctuated by larger raids that tested Roman defensive capabilities. The decision to advance the frontier northward with the construction of the Antonine Wall around 142 CE demonstrated renewed imperial confidence in the possibility of containing the northern tribes through forward defence. This new barrier stretched 39 miles between the Forth and Clyde estuaries, constructed primarily of turf and timber rather than stone. 19 forts housed approximately 7,000 troops, creating a garrison density nearly double that of Hadrian's Wall. The shorter length and more concentrated defences reflected lessons learned from the earlier barriers operation, emphasising rapid response capability over extensive coverage. The Antonine Wall's construction coincided with significant changes in northern British society that would contribute to the emergence of distinctly Pictish cultural traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Traprain Law reveals increasing political centralisation among the tribes beyond the Roman frontier, with larger settlements and more elaborate material culture suggesting the development of more complex social hierarchies. The pressure of Roman proximity appears to have accelerated processes of political consolidation that would eventually produce the Pictish kingdoms of the early historic period. The abandonment of the Antonine Wall around 162 CE marked the final Roman retreat to Hadrian's Wall, establishing a frontier that would remain essentially stable for the next 2 centuries. This withdrawal reflected not military defeat but rather imperial recognition that the costs of maintaining an advanced frontier exceeded the benefits of controlling additional Scottish territory. The decision had profound implications for the development of northern British societies, removing direct Roman pressure while maintaining the cultural and economic influences that would shape Pictish civilization. The period between the abandonment of the Antonine Wall and the Great Conspiracy of 367 CE witnessed the gradual transformation of the tribal confederations described by earlier Roman sources into the Pictish kingdoms that would dominate northern Scotland. This process involved both internal political development and changing relationships with Roman Britain, as trade, diplomacy, and intermittent warfare created new forms of cultural exchange across Hadrian's Wall. Archaeological evidence suggests increasing sophistication in Pictish material culture during this period, with elaborate metalwork and stone sculpture indicating the emergence of powerful royal courts capable of patronising skilled craftsmen. The evolution of Pictish warfare during these centuries reflected both indigenous traditions and adaptation to Roman military techniques. Archaeological finds from sites like Clatchard Craig reveal weapons that combined Celtic design elements with innovations derived from contact with Roman forces. Long iron swords with elaborate hilts maintained the traditional emphasis on individual combat prowess, while incorporating metallurgical techniques learned through trade or capture of Roman equipment. Spearheads show similar patterns of technological adaptation, with socketed points designed for thrusting rather than throwing, suggesting changes in tactical deployment. The cultural significance of body painting and tattooing that gave the Picts their Roman name Picti represented more than a mere decoration or intimidation. Classical sources describe elaborate designs covering warriors' bodies, created using blue woad dye extracted from the leaves of Isatis tinctoria. These markings served multiple functions within Pictish society, indicating clan affiliation, social status, and spiritual protection, while creating a distinctive visual identity that set Pictish warriors apart from their neighbours. The complexity of these designs, as described by Roman observers, suggests specialised practitioners who maintain traditional knowledge about appropriate patterns and their meanings. Archaeological evidence for Pictish body art remains indirect but compelling. Bronze mirrors found in high-status burials often bear elaborate decorative schemes that may reflect the patterns used in body painting, while carved symbol stones display motifs that could represent tattoo designs rendered in permanent form. The technical skill required to create these intricate patterns indicates sophisticated artistic traditions that were maintained alongside other forms of cultural knowledge within Pictish society. The military organisation that made possible the Great Conspiracy of 367 CE represented the culmination of centuries of political development among the peoples beyond Hadrian's Wall. This coordinated assault on Roman Britain involved not only the Picts, but also the Scots of Dalriada, the mysterious Attacoti, and Saxon raiders from across the North Sea. The scale and timing of these simultaneous attacks required unprecedented levels of communication and planning among groups that had previously operated independently, suggesting the emergence of new forms of political leadership capable of organising large-scale military operations. Roman sources describe the conspiracy as beginning with coordinated attacks along multiple frontiers designed to overwhelm imperial defences through sheer numbers and geographic dispersal. Pictish forces struck south from beyond Hadrian's Wall, while Saxon longships raided the eastern coasts and Irish raiders attacked western Britain. The simultaneous nature of these assaults prevented Roman commanders from concentrating their forces against any single threat, allowing the attackers to penetrate deep into the province before effective resistance could be organised. The success of the initial attacks reflected sophisticated intelligence gathering and strategic planning that contradicted Roman assumptions about barbarian military capabilities. The conspirators demonstrated detailed knowledge of Roman defensive dispositions, timing their assaults to coincide with periods of political instability within the empire when reinforcements were unlikely to arrive from continental provinces. The coordination required for such operations suggests the existence of diplomatic networks and communication systems that connected previously disparate peoples across northern Britain and beyond. Ammianus Marcellinus provides the most detailed contemporary account of the conspiracy, describing how the attackers ranged freely across Roman Britain, killing and capturing civilians while avoiding direct confrontation with organised military units. This strategy of economic warfare aimed to undermine imperial authority by demonstrating Rome's inability to protect its subjects rather than seeking decisive military victory. The psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their immediate material damage, shaking confidence in Roman power throughout the province. The Roman response to the Great Conspiracy revealed both the empire's continued military capabilities and the limitations of its defensive strategy in Britain. Count Theodosius arrived with substantial reinforcements from Gaul and conducted a systematic campaign to restore imperial authority, combining military operations with diplomatic initiatives designed to divide the conspirators. His success in ending the immediate crisis demonstrated that Rome retained the capacity for effective military action when sufficient resources were committed to British defence. However, the conspiracy's long-term significance lay not in its immediate military outcomes, but in its demonstration of the sophisticated political and military organisation that had developed among the peoples beyond Roman control. The ability to coordinate such extensive operations across multiple theatres revealed the emergence of new forms of leadership and communication that would characterise the post-Roman period in northern Britain. the Pictish contribution to this effort established their reputation as formidable opponents whose military capabilities would continue to challenge their neighbours for centuries to come. The withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain in 410 CE created a power vacuum that fundamentally altered the political landscape of northern Scotland. As imperial authority collapsed south of Hadrian's Wall, the Pictish confederations that had resisted Roman expansion for centuries found themselves free to expand their territories and consolidate their political structures without external interference. This freedom coincided with internal developments that had been building for generations. As tribal chieftains accumulated wealth and power through successful raids and diplomatic alliances, the result was the emergence of distinct Pictish kingdoms that would dominate the Scottish Highlands and eastern lowlands for the next 3 centuries. Archaeological evidence from major Pictish centres reveals a dramatic increase in construction activity during the 5th century, suggesting rapid political centralisation and economic growth. At Burghead in Moray, excavations have uncovered massive timber-framed ramparts that enclosed an area of nearly 30 acres, making it one of the largest fortified sites in early medieval Europe. The scale of these defences required coordinated labour from across the surrounding region, indicating the emergence of political authorities capable of mobilising substantial resources for major construction projects. Within the fortified enclosure, archaeologists have discovered evidence of specialised craft production, including high-quality metalworking and the carving of elaborate stone sculptures that would become hallmarks of Pictish royal centres. The formation of the major Pictish kingdoms reflected both geographical constraints and political opportunities created by the post-Roman environment. In the far north, the Kingdom of Cat emerged in what is now Caithness and Sutherland, taking its name from the Catti tribe mentioned in Roman sources. The harsh climate and limited agricultural potential of this region meant that Cat remained relatively small in population, but its strategic position controlling the northern sea routes gave its rulers influence disproportionate to their territorial extent. Archaeological evidence from sites like the cairns of Col suggests that Cat's rulers maintained extensive trade networks reaching to Orkney and beyond, importing luxury goods and raw materials that supported their political authority. The Kingdom of CE developed in the Central Highlands, encompassing much of modern Inverness Shire and the Great Glen. This territory's mountainous terrain provided natural defensive advantages, while its river systems offered access to both the North Sea and Atlantic coasts. The rulers of CE established their primary centre at Craig Fadrig near Inverness, where excavations have revealed a vitrified fort whose stone ramparts were fused by intense heat during construction or destruction. The technical expertise required to create such structures suggests sophisticated engineering knowledge and access to skilled craftsmen who could execute complex architectural projects. Further south, the Kingdom of Sir emerged in what would later become Angus and the Mearns, controlling fertile agricultural lands along the eastern coast. This region's proximity to the former Roman frontier meant that Sir Kyn's rulers had extensive experience dealing with imperial forces and their British successors, knowledge that proved valuable as political conditions changed throughout the 5th century. The kingdom's name derives from the tribal designation Corcu Loigd, suggesting possible Irish connections that may reflect early migration or marriage alliances between Pictish and Gaelic elites. The southern Pictish kingdom of Fib controlled territories in modern Fife, Kinross, and parts of Perthshire, occupying some of the most fertile agricultural land in Scotland. This kingdom's strategic position between the firths of Forth and Tay gave its rulers control over important trade routes, while providing access to marine resources that supplemented agricultural production. Archaeological evidence from sites like Clatchard Craig reveals extensive settlement activity during the 5th and 6th centuries, with multiple phases of construction indicating sustained population growth and economic development. The territorial boundaries between these kingdoms remained fluid throughout the early period of Pictish consolidation, shifting in response to military campaigns, marriage alliances, and demographic changes. Unlike the fixed frontiers that characterised Roman administration, Pictish territorial organisation emphasised control over people and resources rather than specific geographical areas. This flexibility allowed successful rulers to expand their influence through conquest or diplomacy, while providing mechanisms for peaceful resolution of territorial disputes through traditional legal procedures. The political structures that governed these emerging kingdoms combined traditional Celtic institutions with innovations developed in response to changing circumstances. Each kingdom was ruled by a king whose authority derived from both hereditary claims and demonstrated military success, but the mechanisms for selecting rulers differed significantly from contemporary European practices. The Pictish system of matrilineal succession represented one of the most distinctive features of their political organisation, requiring that kings trace their legitimacy through their mothers rather than their fathers. This matrilineal system had profound implications for Pictish politics and society that extended far beyond simple succession procedures. Unlike patrilineal systems where royal bloodlines could be traced through male ancestors, matrilineal succession meant that a king's sons could not automatically inherit his throne. Instead, succession typically passed to the king's nephews through his sisters, or to other male relatives who could demonstrate maternal descent from previous rulers. This system ensured that royal bloodlines remained closely connected to the broader population, while preventing the concentration of power within narrow dynastic lines. The practical operation of matrilineal succession required sophisticated genealogical knowledge and legal procedures to validate competing claims to royal authority. Pictish society developed specialised classes of legal scholars and genealogists who maintained detailed records of royal lineages and the complex relationships that determined legitimate succession. These specialists played crucial roles during succession crises, providing authoritative interpretations of traditional law that could resolve disputes between rival claimants without resort to warfare. The matrilineal system also influenced Pictish marriage practices and diplomatic relationships in ways that distinguished them from their neighbours. Royal marriages served primarily to create political alliances rather than to secure dynastic succession, since children of such unions would inherit their status through their mothers' lineages rather than their fathers'. This arrangement allowed Pictish kings to contract marriages with foreign princesses without compromising their kingdom's independence, while enabling complex alliance networks that could shift in response to changing political circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests that the matrilineal system may have had religious dimensions that reflected pre-Christian beliefs about the sources of royal authority. Symbol stones from across Pictish territories frequently depict female figures in positions of prominence, often associated with symbols of power and fertility that may represent goddess figures or deified ancestors. The prominence of these female images in royal iconography suggests that Pictish concepts of legitimate authority were intimately connected to female lineages and the supernatural powers they were believed to transmit. The earliest Pictish kings known from historical sources emerged from the shadowy period following Roman withdrawal, when oral traditions and fragmentary written records begin to provide names and approximate dates for specific rulers. Drestmakerp appears in multiple king lists as one of the most significant early Pictish monarchs, credited with a reign of 100 years that clearly represents legendary rather than historical chronology. The name Dress derives from a Celtic root meaning riot or tumult, possibly indicating a warrior king whose military prowess became the foundation for later legendary elaboration. The figure of Drestmakerp illustrates the complex relationship between historical fact and mythological tradition that characterises early Pictish sources. While the specific details of his reign cannot be verified through contemporary evidence, the consistent appearance of his name in multiple independent traditions suggests that he represents a historical figure whose achievements were sufficiently remarkable to ensure his preservation in oral tradition. The attribution of an impossibly long reign may reflect the compression of multiple rulers with similar names, or the symbolic representation of a golden age of Pictish power and prosperity. Later king lists preserve the names of numerous other early Pictish rulers, including Talorc mac Acivir, Nechtain Morbe, and Gartnate mac Girom, whose reigns span the crucial period of kingdom formation during the 5th and 6th centuries. These names demonstrate the Celtic linguistic heritage of Pictish royal families, while revealing naming patterns that would persist throughout the period of independent Pictish rule. The element mac appears consistently in royal genealogies, but its use in the context of matrilineal succession suggests that it may have indicated maternal rather than paternal relationships in some cases. The reliability of these early king lists remains a subject of scholarly debate, as they were compiled centuries after the events they purport to record, and may reflect later political propaganda rather than accurate historical memory. The Pictish Chronicle, preserved in medieval manuscripts, provides regnal lengths and genealogical information that cannot be verified through independent sources, while the apparent synchronization of Pictish and Irish royal chronologies suggests possible manipulation of the historical record to support contemporary political claims. Despite these limitations, the king lists provide valuable insights into Pictish political organization and cultural values during the period of kingdom formation. The consistent emphasis on military achievements and territorial expansion in the brief notices accompanying royal names reflects a society where political authority depended on demonstrated success in warfare and diplomacy. The preservation of specific battle sites and conquest narratives suggests that these achievements were celebrated in oral tradition and may have been commemorated through ritual performances that reinforced royal legitimacy. The establishment of major Pictish political centres during this period represented both practical administrative needs and symbolic assertions of royal authority. Scone, located at the confluence of the rivers Tay and Almond, emerged as one of the most important ceremonial sites in Pictish Scotland, serving as a traditional location for royal inaugurations and assemblies. The site's strategic position at the junction of major river systems made it accessible to representatives from across Pictish territories, while its elevated position provided natural defensive advantages. Archaeological investigations at Scone have revealed evidence of continuous occupation from the Iron Age through the medieval period, with particularly intensive activity during the 5th and 6th centuries corresponding to the rise of Pictish royal power. Excavations have uncovered substantial timber buildings that may have served as royal halls, along with evidence of craft production and long-distance trade that indicates the site's importance as an economic as well as political centre. The discovery of imported pottery and metalwork demonstrates connections with Ireland, Wales, and continental Europe that reflect the international scope of early Pictish diplomacy. Fertiviat in Strathern developed as another major royal centre during the early Pictish period, occupying a strategic position in the fertile valley of the River Erne. The site's name derives from Pictish elements meaning hillfort of the Venicones, referencing the Iron Age tribe that originally controlled this territory. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive earthwork defences that were expanded and strengthened during the Pictish period, creating a fortified complex that could accommodate large assemblies and house substantial royal retinues. The ceremonial significance of Forteviot extended beyond its practical functions as a royal residence and administrative centre. The site contains numerous carved stones bearing Pictish symbols and Christian motifs that suggest its role in religious as well as secular ceremonies. The famous Duplin cross, discovered nearby, bears inscriptions in both Latin and Ogham script that commemorate Constantine, son of Fergus, indicating the site's continued importance into the 9th century when Pictish and Scottish kingdoms were beginning to merge. Burghead's development as a major Pictish centre represented the kingdom's maritime orientation and the importance of seaborne trade and communication networks. The site's massive fortifications enclosed workshops for metalworking, bone carving, and other specialised crafts that produced goods for both local consumption and long-distance exchange. The discovery of numerous carved stone slabs bearing Pictish symbols suggests that Burghead served as a centre for the production of royal monuments that were distributed throughout Pictish territories as symbols of royal authority. The religious dimensions of these major centres reflected the complex spiritual landscape of early medieval Scotland, where traditional Celtic beliefs coexisted with expanding Christian influence. Many Pictish royal sites contain evidence of both pagan and Christian religious practices, suggesting a gradual transition rather than sudden conversion. The integration of Christian symbols with traditional Pictish motifs on carved stones indicates sophisticated theological adaptation that maintained cultural continuity while accommodating new religious ideas. The emergence of Christianity among the Pictish kingdoms during the 6th century coincided with an extraordinary flowering of artistic expression that would produce some of the most sophisticated stone sculpture in early medieval Europe. This cultural renaissance manifested most dramatically in the creation of symbol stones, massive granite and sandstone monuments that combined traditional Pictish iconography with Christian imagery in ways that revealed the complex spiritual and political landscape of early medieval Scotland. These carved monuments, numbering in the hundreds across former Pictish territories, represent far more than decorative art. They constitute a comprehensive communication system that recorded territorial claims, genealogical relationships, and religious beliefs in visual form. The classification system developed by modern archaeologists divides Pictish symbol stones into 3 distinct categories based on their iconographic content and carving techniques. Class 1 stones represent the earliest tradition, featuring Pictish symbols carved in simple incised lines without any Christian imagery. These monuments typically stand between 4 and 8 feet in height, their surfaces bearing combinations of abstract geometric designs and stylized animal figures executed with remarkable precision despite their apparent simplicity. The symbols appear in consistent pairings across different sites, suggesting a standardized symbolic language that was understood throughout Pictish territories. Class 2 stones mark the period of Christian conversion, combining traditional Pictish symbols with crosses and other Christian motifs in complex compositional schemes. These monuments demonstrate sophisticated carving techniques, with symbols rendered in raised relief rather than simple incision. The crosses on Class 2 stones often incorporate Celtic interlace patterns and zoomorphic designs that reflect Irish artistic influence, while maintaining distinctively Pictish characteristics. The integration of pagan and Christian elements on these stones suggests a gradual process of religious transformation rather than sudden conversion, with traditional symbols maintaining their significance within a Christian interpretive framework. Class 3 stones represent the final phase of Pictish stone sculpture, featuring purely Christian iconography without traditional Pictish symbols. These monuments often take the form of elaborate cross slabs decorated with complex interlace patterns, human figures, and biblical scenes. The artistic quality of Class 3 stones reaches extraordinary levels of sophistication, with carvers demonstrating mastery of perspective, proportion, and narrative composition that rivals contemporary manuscript illumination. The absence of traditional Pictish symbols on these monuments may indicate the complete Christianization of Pictish elite culture by the 8th century. The geographical distribution of symbol stones across Scotland reveals important patterns about Pictish territorial organisation and cultural influence. The highest concentrations occur in the fertile agricultural regions of Angus, Aberdeenshire and Moray, areas that correspond to the heartlands of the major Pictish kingdoms. However, isolated examples appear as far north as Shetland and as far south as the Forth Valley, suggesting that Pictish cultural influence extended well beyond the core territories of their political control. The placement of symbol stones within the landscape appears deliberate, with many monuments positioned at territorial boundaries, river crossings, or elevated locations that would ensure maximum visibility to travellers. The iconographic vocabulary of Pictish symbol stones encompasses approximately 30 distinct symbols that appear in various combinations across different monuments. The most frequently occurring symbols include the crescent and V-rod, double disc and Z-rod, serpent, eagle, boar and mirror and comb. Each symbol appears to have carried specific meanings within Pictish society, though the exact interpretation of these meanings remains one of the most challenging problems in early medieval archaeology. The consistency with which certain symbols appear together suggests that they formed meaningful combinations, possibly recording genealogical relationships, territorial claims, or religious beliefs. The crescent and V-rod represents one of the most widespread and distinctive Pictish symbols, appearing on over 50 known monuments across Scotland. The crescent itself resembles a lunar symbol, decorated with internal geometric patterns that vary between different examples, but maintain consistent overall proportions. The V-rod that typically accompanies the crescent appears to pierce or overlay the lunar shape, creating a composite symbol whose meaning has generated extensive scholarly debate. Some interpretations suggest astronomical significance, linking the symbol to lunar observations or seasonal festivals, while others propose political meanings related to territorial boundaries or dynastic claims. The double disc and Z-rod constitutes another fundamental element of Pictish symbolic vocabulary, consisting of two circular discs connected by a Z-shaped rod that appears to pass through both circles. The discs often contain elaborate decorative patterns, including spirals, geometric designs, and occasionally zoomorphic elements. The Z-rod itself varies in its precise configuration, sometimes appearing as a simple angular line and other times displaying more complex curves and decorative elements. The symbol's widespread distribution and consistent form suggest that it carried important meaning within Pictish society, possibly representing concepts of connection, balance, or dual authority. Animal symbols on Pictish stones demonstrate remarkable artistic sophistication and careful attention to naturalistic detail. The Pictish eagle appears with outstretched wings and fierce expression, its feathers rendered with precision that reveals intimate knowledge of avian anatomy. The boar symbol shows similar attention to realistic detail, with bristled hide and prominent tusks that emphasize the animal's aggressive power. The serpent appears in various configurations, sometimes as a simple S-curve and other times as an elaborate interlaced design that demonstrates clear influence from Irish artistic traditions. The mirror and comb symbols present particular interpretive challenges due to their apparent connection to personal grooming and feminine identity. The mirror typically appears as a circular or oval shape, with a handle, often decorated with intricate patterns that echo the designs found on actual bronze mirrors discovered in Pictish archaeological contexts. The comb shows the distinctive rectangular shape of early medieval examples, with teeth clearly delineated along one edge. These symbols appear frequently in combination with other Pictish motifs, suggesting that they carried meanings beyond simple representation of the grooming implements. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided new insights into the creation and use of Pictish symbol stones. Excavations at Rhynie in Aberdeenshire uncovered a Class 1 symbol stone in its original position within a high-status settlement, providing crucial evidence about the relationship between these monuments and Pictish political centres. The stone stood adjacent to a large timber hall that appears to have served as a royal residence, suggesting that symbol stones functioned as territorial markers associated with elite residences and centres of political authority. The technical aspects of symbol stone creation reveal sophisticated understanding of stone carving techniques and artistic composition. Pictish carvers selected specific types of stone for their monuments, favouring fine-grained sandstones and granites that could support detailed carving while resisting weathering. The tools used in carving included iron chisels of various sizes, allowing for both broad shaping and fine detail work. Evidence from unfinished monuments suggests that carving was accomplished through a systematic process, beginning with rough shaping of the stone and progressing through increasingly refined stages of decoration. The artistic influences visible in Pictish stone sculpture demonstrate extensive cultural connections across early medieval Europe. Irish artistic traditions contributed elaborate interlace patterns and zoomorphic designs that appear on Class II and Class III stones, while Germanic influences can be detected in certain animal styles and decorative motifs. Mediterranean artistic traditions, transmitted through Christian missionary activity, introduced new iconographic programs and compositional techniques that transformed Pictish artistic expression during the 7th and 8th centuries. Pictish metalworking achieved extraordinary levels of sophistication during the 6th through 8th centuries, producing jewellery, weapons, and decorative objects that rank among the finest examples of early medieval craftsmanship. The silver chains discovered in the Norreys law hoard demonstrate technical mastery that rivals contemporary Byzantine goldsmithing, with intricate links fashioned from twisted silver wire and decorated with granulation and filigree work. These chains, some measuring over 6 feet in length, required hundreds of hours of skilled labour and access to substantial quantities of precious metal, indicating the wealth and artistic patronage available to Pictish elites. The St. Ninian's Isle treasure, discovered in 1958 on a small island off the Shetland coast, provides the most spectacular evidence of Pictish metalworking skills. The hoard contains 28 silver objects including bowls, brooches, sword fittings, and a unique hanging bowl that demonstrates the integration of Celtic, Germanic, and Christian artistic traditions. The quality of workmanship evident in these pieces equals or exceeds contemporary examples from major European centres, indicating that Pictish craftsmen had access to the most advanced metallurgical techniques and artistic traditions of their time. The silver bowls from St. Ninian's Isle display sophisticated understanding of metalworking techniques, including repoussé decoration, where designs are hammered from the reverse side to create raised relief patterns on the front surface. The motifs include interlaced animals, geometric patterns, and human figures executed with precision that reveals intimate familiarity with manuscript illumination and stone sculpture traditions. The integration of different decorative techniques on single objects demonstrates the versatility of Pictish metalworkers and their ability to adapt artistic influences from multiple sources. Pictish brooches represent another category of metalwork that achieved remarkable artistic sophistication. The penannular brooch tradition, inherited from earlier Celtic cultures, was transformed by Pictish craftsmen into elaborate status symbols decorated with complex zoomorphic designs and precious stone inlays. The terminals of these brooches often take the form of stylized animal heads with prominent eyes and curved beaks, executed in silver or bronze with gilt details that would have gleamed impressively when worn by their elite owners. The social structure of Pictish society during this period reveals a complex hierarchy that supported the artistic achievements visible in stone sculpture and metalwork. At the apex stood the kings of the major Pictish kingdoms, rulers whose authority derived from both traditional legitimacy and demonstrated military success. These monarchs maintained courts that attracted skilled craftsmen, warriors, and religious specialists whose combined efforts produced the cultural flowering that characterises the 6th through 8th centuries. Archaeological evidence from major Pictish centres reveals the physical infrastructure that supported elite lifestyles and artistic patronage. Excavations at Burghead have uncovered substantial timber halls measuring over 100 feet in length, their interiors divided into multiple chambers that could accommodate large retinues and ceremonial gatherings. The construction of these buildings required sophisticated carpentry skills and access to large quantities of timber, indicating well-organised systems of resource extraction and craft specialisation. The agricultural foundation of Pictish society provided the economic surplus necessary to support non-productive specialists, including craftsmen, warriors, and religious personnel. Pollen analysis from sites across Pictish territories reveals extensive cereal cultivation, with barley, oats, and wheat grown in field systems that show evidence of careful management and crop rotation. The presence of quern, stones, and grain storage pits at settlement sites indicates systematic food processing and storage that could support populations through seasonal variations and periodic crop failures. Cattle raising played an equally important role in Pictish agricultural systems, providing not only meat and dairy products but also leather, bone and horn for craft production. Archaeological assemblages from Pictish sites consistently show high proportions of cattle bones, often from animals slaughtered at optimal ages for meat production rather than after natural death. This pattern suggests systematic herd management designed to maximise protein production while maintaining breeding stock for future generations. The integration of agriculture and pastoralism in Pictish economic systems created opportunities for specialisation and trade that supported the development of complex social hierarchies. Surplus agricultural production could be exchanged for craft goods, weapons, and luxury items that served as markers of social status and political authority. The concentration of high-quality metalwork and imported goods at major Pictish centres indicates the existence of redistribution networks that channeled wealth from agricultural producers to elite consumers. Trade relationships extended far beyond the boundaries of Pictish territories, connecting Scottish communities with partners across the North Sea and beyond. Archaeological evidence includes pottery from the Rhineland, glass beads from the Mediterranean, and amber from the Baltic, demonstrating the extensive networks that brought exotic goods to Pictish markets. These trade connections also facilitated the transmission of artistic techniques and religious ideas that influenced Pictish cultural development during this crucial period. The settlement patterns visible in Pictish territories reflect both defensive considerations and economic opportunities that shaped community organisation. Hill forts continued to serve important functions as refuges and ceremonial centres, but the majority of the population lived in undefended settlements located in fertile river valleys and coastal plains. These communities typically consisted of clusters of round houses surrounded by agricultural fields and pastures, with larger settlements serving as local markets and administrative centres. The roundhouse tradition, inherited from the Iron Age, remained the dominant architectural form throughout the Pictish period, though these structures achieved increasing sophistication in their construction and internal organisation. Excavations at sites like Pitcairn reveal houses with stone foundations supporting timber superstructures, their interiors carefully planned to accommodate specific domestic and craft activities. The presence of hearths, storage areas, and working spaces within these buildings indicates their role as centres of household production as well as residence. The transformation of Pictish religious life began not with dramatic conversion scenes or miraculous demonstrations, but through the patient diplomatic efforts of Irish missionaries who understood that lasting change required the support of political elites. The most significant of these early evangelists was Columba, an Irish nobleman turned monk whose mission to King Briti Mac Mailchun around 565 CE marked the beginning of systematic Christian penetration into the heart of Pictish power. Unlike the confrontational approach often associated with early medieval missionary activity, Columba's strategy emphasised accommodation and gradual transformation, recognising that Pictish society possessed sophisticated religious traditions that could not simply be swept aside through theological argument alone. Columba's journey to the court of Bridi Mac Mailchun at his fortress near Inverness represented a carefully calculated diplomatic mission rather than spontaneous religious enthusiasm. The Irish monk had established his monastery on Iona only 2 years earlier, positioning himself strategically at the intersection of Pictish, Scottish, and Irish territories where he could observe political developments and identify opportunities for Christian expansion. His decision to approach Brede directly reflected understanding that successful conversion of Pictish society required royal patronage, as traditional Celtic political structures concentrated religious as well as secular authority in the hands of kings and their immediate supporters. The fortress where Columba encountered Brede occupied a commanding position overlooking the River Ness, its timber-laced stone ramparts enclosing an area large enough to accommodate substantial royal retinues and visiting delegations. Archaeological investigations at nearby Craig Fadrig have revealed the scale of such royal centres, with massive defensive works protecting elaborate timber halls where kings conducted the ceremonial and administrative business that maintained their authority. The physical setting of Columba's mission thus emphasised the political dimensions of religious conversion, as the Irish monk sought to influence the most powerful figure in northern Pictland within the symbolic heart of his territorial control. A Domnann's Life of Columba, written over a century after these events, provides detailed accounts of the saint's encounters with Pictish religious traditions and his gradual success in winning royal support for Christian teaching. While these narratives clearly reflect later hagiographical conventions and should not be read as literal historical records, they preserve valuable insights into the complex process of religious transformation that characterised 6th century Pictland. The text describes Columba's confrontations with Pictish druids, presenting these encounters as contests between competing supernatural powers rather than purely theological debates. The druids who opposed Columba's mission represented the established religious hierarchy that had maintained Pictish spiritual traditions for centuries. These figures served not only as priests and ritual specialists, but also as legal experts, genealogists and advisors to royal courts throughout Pictish territories. Their opposition to Christian teaching reflected both genuine theological disagreement and practical concerns about the threat that foreign religious ideas posed to their traditional authority and social position. The gradual displacement of druidical influence by Christian clerics represented one of the most profound social transformations in Pictish history. Archaeological evidence suggests that the conversion process involved careful negotiation between Christian missionaries and traditional religious authorities, rather than simple replacement of pagan practices with Christian alternatives. Excavations at sites like Port Mahomac in Easter Ross have revealed evidence of Christian religious activity overlying earlier ritual deposits, indicating continuity of sacred space usage despite changing religious affiliations. The positioning of early Christian monuments at locations previously associated with pre-Christian religious activity demonstrates deliberate attempts to maintain spiritual continuity while introducing new theological concepts. The success of Columba's mission to Bride mac Maelcion established a precedent for Christian expansion throughout Pictish territories, though the process of conversion varied significantly between different kingdoms and social groups. Royal conversion typically preceded broader social transformation, as kings who adopted Christian beliefs used their political authority to encourage similar changes among their subjects. However, the decentralised nature of Pictish political organisation meant that conversion proceeded at different rates in different regions, with some areas maintaining traditional religious practices well into the 7th century. The establishment of monastic centres represented the most visible manifestation of Christian influence in Pictish society, as Irish missionaries founded communities that served simultaneously as religious, educational, and economic institutions. These monasteries differed significantly from their continental counterparts, reflecting the distinctive characteristics of Celtic Christianity that emphasised ascetic practice, scholarly learning and close integration with local political structures. The Irish monastic tradition that influenced Pictish Christianity had developed in isolation from Roman ecclesiastical authority, creating distinctive practices and theological emphases that would shape Pictish religious life for centuries. Iona emerged as the most influential monastic centre affecting Pictish Christianity, though its direct political control extended only to the small island where Columba established his community. The monastery's influence derived from its role as a centre of learning and artistic production that attracted students and patrons from across the Celtic world. The scriptorium at Iona produced illuminated manuscripts that set artistic standards for monastic communities throughout Scotland and Ireland, while its school trained generations of missionaries and scholars who carried Celtic Christian traditions to new territories. The Book of Kells, probably produced at Iona during the late 8th century, demonstrates the extraordinary artistic achievements of Celtic monasticism and the sophisticated cultural synthesis that characterised Pictish Christianity. This magnificent gospel book combines Irish manuscript traditions with artistic influences drawn from Germanic, Mediterranean and indigenous Celtic sources, creating illuminations of unprecedented complexity and beauty. The intricate interlace patterns, stylized animal forms, and geometric designs that decorate its pages reflect the same artistic vocabulary visible in Pictish stone sculpture and metalwork, indicating extensive cultural exchange between monastic and secular artistic traditions. Port Mahomac developed as a major monastic centre within Pictish territories, its community establishing workshops for manuscript production, stone carving, and metalworking that rivaled the achievements of Iona itself. Excavations at the site have revealed evidence of intensive craft production during the 7th and 8th centuries, including fragments of decorated metalwork, carved stone architectural elements, and tools associated with manuscript illumination. The scale of these activities indicates that Port Mahomac served not only local religious needs, but also functioned as a centre of artistic production that supplied luxury goods to elite patrons throughout Pictish territories. The monastery's location on the Tarbet Peninsula provided access to maritime trade routes that connected Pictish communities with partners across the North Sea and beyond. Archaeological evidence includes pottery from the Rhineland, glass vessels from the Mediterranean, and amber from the Baltic, demonstrating the extensive networks that brought exotic materials to monastic workshops. These trade connections facilitated not only economic exchange, but also the transmission of artistic techniques and religious ideas that influenced the development of Pictish Christianity. Deir Abbey in Buchan represents another important centre of Pictish monasticism, though its early history remains obscured by later medieval developments. The Book of Deir, produced at this monastery during the 10th century, preserves unique evidence of Pictish linguistic traditions in its Gaelic marginalia that record land grants and legal agreements using terminology that may derive from earlier Pictish legal vocabulary. The manuscript's illuminations demonstrate continued adherence to Celtic artistic traditions well after the political integration of Pictish territories into the emerging Scottish kingdom. The transformation of Pictish art during the Christian period represents one of the most dramatic cultural changes in early medieval Europe, as traditional symbolic vocabularies were reinterpreted within Christian theological frameworks while maintaining their distinctive regional characteristics. The symbol stones that had served as territorial markers and genealogical records during the pagan period were gradually replaced by elaborate cross slabs that combined Christian iconography with traditional Pictish artistic techniques. This transformation reflects not simple replacement of pagan art with Christian alternatives, but rather sophisticated synthesis that preserved cultural continuity while accommodating new religious concepts. The Aberlemno stones provide exceptional examples of this artistic transformation, with their elaborate cross slabs demonstrating the integration of Christian and traditional motifs within unified compositional schemes. The most famous of these monuments depicts a battle scene that may represent the defeat of the Northumbrians at Nechtain in 685 CE, combining historical commemoration with Christian symbolism in ways that reflect the complex relationship between political and religious authority in Pictish society. The cross that dominates the stone's composition serves not merely as a religious symbol, but also as assertion of Christian kingship that legitimised Pictish political authority through divine sanction. The artistic techniques employed in creating these elaborate monuments reveal the sophisticated workshop traditions that developed within Pictish monasteries and royal centres. Stone carvers working during the Christian period demonstrated mastery of relief carving, perspective, and narrative composition that equals the finest contemporary examples from Ireland and Northumbria. The precision required to execute the intricate interlaced patterns that decorate many cross slabs indicates years of specialised training and access to pattern books or other artistic models that transmitted design motifs across wide geographical areas. The iconographic programs visible on Pictish cross slabs reflect sophisticated theological understanding and careful adaptation of Christian symbolism to local cultural contexts. Biblical scenes appear alongside traditional Pictish motifs, in compositions that demonstrate familiarity with continental Christian art, while maintaining distinctively regional characteristics. The Daniel in the lion's den scene that appears on several Pictish monuments, for example, employs artistic conventions derived from Mediterranean sources, but executes them using techniques and stylistic preferences that reflect local artistic traditions. Pictish participation in broader Celtic Christian culture extended beyond stone sculpture to encompass manuscript illumination, ecclesiastical metalwork, and religious architecture that demonstrated the full integration of Pictish communities into the intellectual and artistic networks of early medieval Christianity. The fragmentary remains of Pictish manuscripts suggest that monastic scriptoria throughout Pictish territories produced books that rivaled the achievements of more famous Irish and Northumbrian centres, though the survival of complete examples remains frustratingly rare. The Pictish contribution to ecclesiastical metalwork achieved extraordinary levels of sophistication, as demonstrated by the St. Andrew's sarcophagus and other religious artefacts that combine Christian iconography with traditional Celtic artistic techniques. These objects required access to precious metals, specialised tools and artistic models that indicate the wealth and cultural connections of Pictish religious institutions. The technical mastery evident in their construction demonstrates that Pictish craftsmen had absorbed the most advanced metallurgical techniques available in early medieval Europe while developing distinctive regional styles that reflected local aesthetic preferences. Religious architecture in Pictish territories followed distinctive patterns that reflected both practical considerations and theological emphases characteristic of Celtic Christianity. Unlike the massive stone churches that characterised continental monasticism, Pictish religious buildings typically employed timber construction techniques that created structures more closely integrated with their natural surroundings. Archaeological evidence from sites like Whithorn and Port Mahomac reveals churches built using sophisticated carpentry techniques that created spacious interiors suitable for both liturgical celebration and scholarly activity. The round towers that appear at several Pictish monastic sites represent a distinctive architectural tradition that may reflect Irish influence while serving specifically Scottish defensive and ceremonial functions. These structures, built using carefully fitted stone blocks without mortar, rose to heights of over 100 feet and served as bell towers, refuges during raids, and symbols of monastic authority that could be seen from considerable distances. The technical expertise required for their construction indicates the presence of specialised masons who had mastered advanced building techniques through training at major monastic centres. The consolidation of Christian authority across Pictish territories during the late 7th century coincided with the emergence of military leaders whose strategic vision would fundamentally alter the balance of power in northern Britain. The most significant of these figures was Brydei mac Billy, whose reign from 671 to 693 CE mark the apex of Pictish military achievement and territorial expansion. Unlike his predecessors who had focused primarily on defensive warfare and raiding expeditions, Bridi demonstrated sophisticated understanding of strategic planning and diplomatic coordination that enabled him to conduct sustained military campaigns against multiple enemies while maintaining internal political stability. Bridi's rise to power reflected the complex succession practices that characterised Pictish political organisation, as his claim to the throne derived from maternal lineage connections to previous rulers rather than direct paternal inheritance. His father Billy MacNaithin had ruled the Bretons of Alclute, making Bridi's accession a product of the marriage alliances that linked Pictish royal families with neighbouring kingdoms throughout northern Britain. This background provided him with intimate knowledge of the political and military conditions beyond Pictish borders, intelligence that would prove crucial during his subsequent military campaigns. The political situation that confronted Bridi upon his accession presented both opportunities and challenges that required careful strategic calculation. The Northumbrian kingdom under Ecgfrith had expanded aggressively northward during the mid-7th century, establishing fortified positions along the southern borders of Pictish territory, while conducting regular raids that threatened Pictish agricultural communities and trade routes. Simultaneously, the Scots of Dalriada had recovered from earlier defeats and were pressing eastward into traditional Pictish territories in the Western Highlands. These external pressures coincided with internal succession disputes that had weakened several Pictish kingdoms, creating conditions that demanded decisive military action. Bridi's response demonstrated strategic thinking that transcended the traditional Celtic approach to warfare, which typically emphasised individual heroism and short-term raiding expeditions. Instead of simply responding to enemy incursions, he developed comprehensive military plans that coordinated diplomatic initiatives with carefully timed offensive operations designed to achieve lasting territorial and political advantages. His ability to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods required sophisticated logistical organisation and resource management that reflected the increasing administrative capabilities of Pictish royal governments. The military forces that Bridi assembled for his major campaigns represented the culmination of centuries of tactical development and technological adaptation within Pictish society. Archaeological evidence from weapon burials and settlement sites reveals the evolution of Pictish military equipment during the 7th century, with traditional Celtic weapons being supplemented by innovations derived from contact with Northumbrian and continental European military traditions. Long iron swords remained the primary weapons of elite warriors, but their design had evolved to incorporate features that reflected changing tactical requirements and metallurgical advances. The swords discovered at sites like Ballinaby demonstrate the sophisticated metallurgy that characterised 7th century Pictish weapon production. These blades, measuring between 75 and 85 centimetres in length, were constructed using pattern welding techniques that created flexible yet durable weapons capable of withstanding the stresses of sustained combat. The hilts featured elaborate decorative schemes that incorporated both traditional Celtic motifs and Christian symbolism, reflecting the complex cultural synthesis that characterised Pictish elite culture during this period. Spear technology had similarly evolved to meet changing tactical requirements, with archaeological evidence revealing two distinct types of spearheads that served different battlefield functions. Heavy thrusting spears with broad leaf-shaped points were designed for close combat, while lighter javelins with narrow points could be thrown effectively at distances up to 30 metres. The wooden shafts of these weapons, though rarely preserved in archaeological contexts, were carefully selected from ash or oak timber and could measure up to 3 metres in length for the largest thrusting spears. The shields employed by Pictish warriors during this period represented significant technological advances over earlier Celtic designs. Archaeological fragments and artistic depictions suggest circular shields with diameters between 60 and 80 centimetres, constructed using wooden planks covered with leather and reinforced with iron bosses and rim bindings. The shields were painted with distinctive designs that served both protective and identificatory functions, allowing warriors to recognise allies and enemies in the confusion of battle while displaying clan affiliations and personal achievements. Pictish military organisation during Bride's reign reflected the hierarchical social structure that characterised these northern kingdoms, with different classes of warriors serving distinct tactical roles within larger army formations. At the apex stood the king's personal retinue, professional warriors who maintained their equipment through royal patronage and served as the army's tactical core during major engagements. These elite fighters wore mail shirts imported from Frankish workshops or produced by skilled Pictish metalworkers, providing protection that significantly enhanced their battlefield effectiveness. Below the royal retinue served the warrior bands maintained by regional nobles and clan chiefs, men who combined military service with agricultural or craft activities, but who could be mobilised for extended campaigns when circumstances required. These fighters typically provided their own weapons and equipment, creating armies with varied levels of protection and training that required careful, tactical coordination to achieve maximum effectiveness. The integration of these diverse military elements demanded sophisticated command structures and communication systems that reflected the administrative capabilities of mature Pictish kingdoms. The lowest tier of Pictish military organisation consisted of agricultural levies who could be called upon for defensive operations or short-term campaigns that did not interfere with crucial farming activities. These men fought with simple weapons, including hunting spears, agricultural tools adapted for combat, and slings that could be devastatingly effective in the hands of experienced users. While lacking the equipment and training of professional warriors, these levies provided numerical strength that could prove decisive in major engagements when properly deployed and supported. The fortifications that protected Pictish territories during this period had evolved significantly from the simple hill forts of earlier centuries, incorporating defensive innovations derived from observation of Roman and Northumbrian military engineering. Sites like Burghead featured multiple lines of defence with carefully planned killing grounds where attackers could be subjected to concentrated missile fire from protected positions. The timber-laced stone ramparts that characterised these fortifications provided excellent protection against both direct assault and siege equipment, while creating elevated platforms for defensive artillery. The construction techniques employed at major Pictish fortifications demonstrate sophisticated understanding of military engineering principles that rivaled contemporary European developments. The ramparts at Burghead incorporated drainage systems that prevented water damage to timber reinforcements, while the gate structures featured complex approaches that channeled attackers into narrow passages where they could be easily contained and destroyed. The scale of these defensive works required coordinated labour from across entire kingdoms, indicating the organisational capabilities that supported Pictish military achievements. Interior arrangements within these fortified centres reveal their dual functions as military strongholds and administrative headquarters that coordinated both defensive operations and offensive campaigns. Large timber halls provided accommodation for substantial garrisons, while serving as venues for the ceremonial activities that maintained warrior loyalty and morale. Workshops within the fortified areas produced weapons and equipment, while maintaining the specialised tools required for siege warfare and field engineering. The diplomatic initiatives that preceded Bride's major military campaigns demonstrate the sophisticated political intelligence that characterised Pictish strategic planning during this period. Archaeological evidence and later historical sources suggest that Pictish emissaries maintained regular contact with potential allies throughout northern Britain and beyond, gathering information about enemy capabilities while negotiating the agreements that would prove crucial during subsequent military operations. These diplomatic activities required individuals with linguistic skills and cultural knowledge that enabled them to operate effectively in diverse political environments. The alliance networks that Brudai constructed prior to his confrontation with Northumbria involved complex negotiations with multiple partners whose interests did not always align with Pictish objectives. The Britons of Strathclyde provided crucial support based on shared opposition to Northumbrian expansion, while Irish kingdoms offered assistance that reflected their own conflicts with Northumbrian client states in Ulster. These relationships required careful management to prevent conflicts between allies, while ensuring that each partner contributed effectively to common military objectives. The intelligence gathering that supported Pictish military planning during this period appears to have involved systematic observation of enemy territories and capabilities that went far beyond traditional Celtic scouting activities. Archaeological evidence from border regions suggests the existence of forward observation posts that monitored Northumbrian military movements while providing secure bases for reconnaissance expeditions into enemy territory. The information gathered through these activities enabled Pictish commanders to plan operations with detailed knowledge of enemy strengths, weaknesses, and likely responses to different tactical approaches. The Battle of Dun Nechtain in 685 CE represented the culmination of Bredai's strategic planning and the decisive engagement that established Pictish dominance over their southern neighbours for the next century. The battle's outcome reflected not only tactical superiority on the day of engagement, but also the comprehensive preparation that had characterised Pictish military development throughout Bredai's reign. The Northumbrian army that advanced into Pictish territory represented one of the most formidable military forces in contemporary Europe, equipped with the finest weapons and armour while commanded by experienced officers who had achieved notable successes against other Celtic opponents. King Ecgfrith's decision to invade Pictish territory reflected Northumbrian confidence in their military superiority and strategic miscalculation about Pictish capabilities and intentions. The Northumbrian army that crossed into Pictish territory included the king's personal retinue of professional warriors, regional levies from throughout the kingdom, and allied contingents from client peoples who had been incorporated into the Northumbrian military system. This force represented the largest army that Northumbria had ever deployed against the Picts, reflecting Ecgfrith's determination to achieve decisive victory that would eliminate the northern threat to his kingdom's security. The site chosen for the confrontation provided significant tactical advantages to the defending Pictish forces, while negating many of the advantages that Northumbrian military organisation typically provided in open battle. Dun Nechtain, located near the modern town of Dun Nechtain in Angus, occupied elevated ground that commanded approaches from the south while providing multiple retreat routes towards secure Pictish territories. The terrain featured marshy ground that would impede cavalry operations while offering concealed positions where Pictish forces could establish ambush positions. Bredai's tactical deployment demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combined arms operations that maximised the effectiveness of different warrior types within his army. Light infantry armed with javelins and slings occupied concealed positions on the flanks where they could harass advancing Northumbrians while avoiding direct confrontation with heavily armoured opponents. The main Pictish battle line consisted of spear-armed infantry supported by the elite warriors of the royal retinue, positioned to take advantage of the terrain while maintaining flexibility to respond to changing tactical situations. The battle itself unfolded as a devastating defeat for Northumbrian arms, with King Ecgfrith among the dead and his army effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Contemporary sources describe the engagement as lasting most of a day, with initial Northumbrian advances being contained and gradually reversed through Pictish tactical superiority and superior knowledge of local terrain. The collapse of Northumbrian resistance appears to have been sudden and complete, with organised retreat becoming impossible once the army's command structure had been disrupted by heavy casualties among the leadership. The immediate consequences of Dun Nechtain extended far beyond the battlefield itself, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout northern Britain while establishing Pictish military reputation that would influence diplomatic relationships for generations. The destruction of Northumbrian military power eliminated the primary external threat to Pictish security, while creating opportunities for territorial expansion that Bredi and his successors would exploit systematically. The psychological impact of the victory resonated throughout the Celtic world, demonstrating that even the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could be defeated through superior strategy and tactical execution. The territorial gains that followed Dun Nechtain reflected careful strategic planning that had preceded the battle itself, with Pictish forces moving quickly to occupy key positions that had been identified during earlier reconnaissance activities. Fortified positions along the former frontier were either destroyed or garrisoned with Pictish troops, while administrative centres were established to govern newly acquired territories. These occupation forces included not only military personnel but also administrators, craftsmen, and agricultural specialists who could integrate conquered areas into existing Pictish economic and political systems. The diplomatic ramifications of Pictish victory at Dun Nechtain created new opportunities for alliance building and territorial expansion that would characterise the remainder of Bridi's reign. Neighbouring kingdoms that had previously maintained cautious neutrality now sought Pictish friendship, while former Northumbrian allies reconsidered their political affiliations in light of changed military circumstances. These diplomatic developments required sophisticated negotiation skills and strategic vision that demonstrated the maturity of Pictish political institutions during this crucial period. The triumph at Dun Nechtain established a foundation of military prestige that would enable the most ambitious Pictish ruler in recorded history to transform victory into lasting territorial expansion and political dominance. Oengus mac Fergusa, who seized the throne around 729 CE through a combination of military prowess and strategic marriage alliances, inherited a kingdom whose confidence had been restored by Bridi's earlier successes, but whose full potential remained unrealised. Unlike his predecessors who had focused primarily on defensive operations and opportunistic raiding, Oengus demonstrated strategic vision that encompassed the systematic conquest of neighbouring territories and the creation of a Pictish hegemony that would dominate northern Britain for over a century. The political landscape that confronted Oengus upon his accession presented unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion, as the kingdoms surrounding Pictish territories had been weakened by internal succession disputes and external military pressures. Dalriada, the Scottish kingdom that controlled much of the western Highlands and Islands, faced severe internal divisions as rival claimants contested the throne following the death of King Selbach in 730 CE. These succession struggles had fragmented Scottish military resources while creating opportunities for external intervention that a skilled strategist could exploit to achieve decisive advantages. Simultaneously, the Kingdom of Strathclyde found itself increasingly isolated as Northumbrian recovery from the Dun Nechtain disaster gradually restored Anglo-Saxon influence in southern Scotland. The Britons of Alclut faced pressure from multiple directions, with Pictish expansion threatening their eastern territories while renewed Northumbrian aggression menaced their southern borders. This strategic predicament forced Strathclyde's rulers to seek allies wherever they could find them, creating diplomatic opportunities that Oengus would manipulate with remarkable skill throughout his reign. The military machine that Oengus inherited from his predecessors had evolved significantly since Bridi's time, incorporating tactical innovations derived from successful campaigns while maintaining the core organisational principles that had enabled earlier Pictish victories. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and settlement sites reveals continued technological advancement in Pictish military equipment, with sword designs showing influence from Frankish and Scandinavian models while maintaining distinctively Celtic decorative traditions. The pattern-welded blades discovered at sites like Norrie's Law demonstrate metallurgical techniques that produced weapons of exceptional quality, their complex construction requiring specialised knowledge that was carefully guarded within elite warrior families. Engus's first major campaign targeted the fractured kingdom of Dalriada, where succession disputes had created conditions ideal for external intervention. The Pictish king's strategy involved supporting one claimant against his rivals while simultaneously preparing to eliminate all Scottish resistance once his chosen candidate had consolidated power. This approach required sophisticated intelligence networks and diplomatic coordination that demonstrated the administrative capabilities that Pictish royal government had developed during the early 8th century. The campaign opened with coordinated attacks against Scottish strongholds in Lorne and Cawal, regions whose mountainous terrain had traditionally provided natural defences against external invasion. Pictish forces employed siege techniques that reflected knowledge gained through contact with continental European military traditions, using portable artillery and engineering equipment that enabled them to reduce fortified positions that had previously been considered impregnable. The capture of Dunned, the traditional ceremonial centre of Scottish kingship, provided Oengus with symbolic victory that undermined Scottish resistance throughout the Western Territories. Archaeological excavations at Dunned have revealed evidence of violent destruction during the early 8th century, with burned timber structures and scattered metalwork indicating the thoroughness of Pictish occupation. The discovery of Pictish-style brooches and weapons within the destruction layers suggests that Oengus established a permanent garrison at this crucial site, transforming the former Scottish Royal Centre into a forward base for further expansion into the Western Islands. The symbolic significance of this occupation extended far beyond its military value, as control of Dunned enabled Oengus to claim legitimate authority over Scottish territories through possession of their traditional inauguration site. The systematic nature of Pictish expansion under Oengus becomes apparent through analysis of contemporary sources and archaeological evidence from across the conquered territories. Rather than simply conducting destructive raids, Pictish forces established administrative structures that integrated captured regions into existing royal systems, while maintaining sufficient military presence to prevent rebellion. This approach required substantial resources and organisational capabilities that reflected the economic prosperity that had developed within Pictish territories during the early 8th century. The wealth that supported Oengus's military campaigns derived from multiple sources that demonstrated the diversified economic foundation of mature Pictish civilization. Agricultural production had intensified throughout Pictish territories during the 7th and early 8th centuries, with archaeological evidence revealing expanded field systems and improved storage facilities that could support larger populations while generating surpluses for redistribution. Pollen analysis from sites across Aberdeenshire and Angus shows increased cereal cultivation during this period, with new crops including rye and improved varieties of barley that enhanced agricultural productivity. Simultaneously, craft production had achieved unprecedented levels of sophistication, with specialised workshops producing luxury goods that served both domestic consumption and long-distance trade. The metalworking traditions that had produced the St. Ninian's Isle treasure continued to flourish under royal patronage, creating elaborate jewellery, weapons, and ceremonial objects that displayed Pictish wealth and artistic achievement to diplomatic partners throughout Northern Europe. The technical mastery evident in these productions required access to rare materials and specialised knowledge that indicated extensive trade networks reaching from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. The construction activities that characterised Oengus's reign provide dramatic evidence of the resources available to Pictish rulers during this golden age of power and prosperity. Major royal centres underwent extensive rebuilding programs that created architectural complexes rivaling contemporary developments in Ireland and Northumbria. At Burghead, archaeological evidence reveals massive construction projects that expanded the fortified area while adding sophisticated defensive features, including multiple gate systems and carefully planned internal roadways that could accommodate large military formations. The timber halls constructed within these royal centres achieved remarkable scale and architectural sophistication, with the largest examples measuring over 150 feet in length and featuring complex internal divisions that could accommodate different social functions simultaneously. The construction techniques employed in these buildings demonstrate advanced carpentry skills and access to high-quality timber resources that were carefully selected and processed using specialised tools. The decorative elements visible in surviving architectural fragments reveal artistic programs that integrated traditional Pictish motifs with Christian symbolism, reflecting the cultural synthesis that characterised 8th century Pictish civilization. Religious architecture during Oengus's reign similarly reflected the wealth and artistic patronage available to Pictish institutions, with monastic centres receiving substantial royal support that enabled ambitious building programs and artistic projects. The monastery at Port Mahomac underwent major expansion during this period, with new stone buildings replacing earlier timber structures, while workshops were established for manuscript production and metalworking that would supply luxury goods to elite patrons throughout northern Britain. The scale of these religious foundations required substantial endowments of land and resources that demonstrated royal commitment to Christian institutions while maintaining traditional patterns of elite patronage. The artistic achievements that flourished under royal patronage during Oengus's reign represent the culmination of centuries of cultural development within Pictish society. The symbol stones produced during this period achieved unprecedented levels of sophistication, with elaborate cross slabs that combined complex iconographic programs with technical mastery that rivals the finest contemporary examples from Ireland and continental Europe. The Aberlemno cross slab, probably carved during the mid-8th century, demonstrates the integration of historical narrative with Christian symbolism in compositions that required extensive planning and exceptional carving skills. The iconographic programs visible on these monuments reflect sophisticated theological understanding and careful adaptation of Christian artistic traditions to Pictish cultural contexts. Biblical scenes appear alongside traditional Pictish symbols in arrangements that demonstrate familiarity with continental manuscript traditions, while maintaining distinctively regional characteristics. The Daniel in the Lion's Den scene that appears on several 8th century monuments employs compositional techniques derived from Mediterranean sources, but executes them using artistic conventions that reflect local aesthetic preferences and technical traditions. Manuscript illumination during this period achieved similar levels of artistic sophistication, though the survival of complete examples remains frustratingly limited. The fragmentary remains of 8th century Pictish manuscripts suggest that monastic scriptoria throughout Pictish territories produced books that incorporated the finest artistic traditions available in contemporary Europe, while developing distinctive regional styles. The techniques employed in these productions required access to expensive materials, including vellum, precious metals, and exotic pigments that were obtained through extensive trade networks reaching across the known world. The diplomatic relationships that Oengus cultivated throughout his reign demonstrate the international recognition that Pictish power had achieved by the mid-8th century. Contemporary sources record Pictish embassies to the Frankish court of Charlemagne, indicating that Pictish rulers were recognised as legitimate partners in the complex diplomatic networks that connected early medieval European kingdoms. These relationships provided access to luxury goods, military technologies, and artistic influences that contributed to the cultural flowering that characterised this golden age of Pictish civilization. Trade relationships during this period extended far beyond the diplomatic exchanges that connected Pictish courts with their European counterparts, encompassing commercial networks that brought exotic goods and raw materials to Scottish markets while exporting Pictish products to distant consumers. Archaeological evidence from major Pictish centres includes pottery from the Rhineland, glass vessels from the Mediterranean, and amber from the Baltic, demonstrating the extensive connections that supported Pictish economic prosperity during the 8th century. The expansion of Pictish influence during Oengus's reign extended beyond simple territorial conquest to encompass cultural and economic domination that transformed relationships throughout northern Britain. The establishment of Pictish administrative centres in conquered territories created new markets for Pictish craftsmen, while providing opportunities for cultural exchange that influenced artistic and technological development across the region. The integration of diverse populations within expanded Pictish territories required sophisticated legal and administrative systems that could accommodate different cultural traditions while maintaining political unity. The military campaigns that secured Oengus's territorial expansion continued throughout his reign, with successive operations targeting different enemies as opportunities arose and strategic circumstances changed. The conquest of Strathclyde required different tactical approaches than the earlier Scottish campaigns, as the Britons possessed more sophisticated defensive capabilities and could potentially receive support from Northumbrian allies. Pictish forces adapted their operational methods accordingly, employing siege techniques and diplomatic strategies that reflected the specific challenges posed by each opponent. The Siege of Dumbarton Rock in 756 CE represented the climax of Pictish expansion under Oengus, as this seemingly impregnable fortress commanded the approaches to the Clyde Valley, while serving as the symbolic centre of British resistance to Pictish domination. The reduction of this stronghold required engineering capabilities and logistical organisation that demonstrated the full maturation of Pictish military capabilities during the mid-8th century. Contemporary sources describe the siege as lasting several months, with Pictish forces employing sophisticated blockade techniques that prevented relief expeditions while gradually undermining the defenders' capacity for continued resistance. The cultural impact of Pictish expansion extended throughout the conquered territories, with archaeological evidence revealing the adoption of Pictish artistic styles and technological innovations by previously independent populations. Stone sculpture in former Scottish territories shows clear Pictish influence during the later 8th century, while metalwork traditions demonstrate the integration of Pictish decorative motifs with local artistic preferences. This cultural synthesis created distinctive regional styles that reflected the complex political relationships within the expanded Pictish kingdom while maintaining overall artistic unity. The administrative systems that governed Oengus's expanded territories required unprecedented levels of organisational sophistication, with royal officials responsible for coordinating military operations, collecting tribute, and maintaining communication across territories that stretched from Caithness to the Forth Valley. The development of these administrative capabilities represented one of the most significant achievements of 8th century Pictish civilization, creating governmental structures that could effectively manage resources and populations across diverse geographical and cultural regions. The economic integration of conquered territories within existing Pictish systems created opportunities for specialization and technological innovation that enhanced overall prosperity while strengthening the military capabilities that sustained territorial expansion. The establishment of new craft centres in strategic locations provided employment for displaced populations while generating products that could be traded throughout the expanded kingdom. These economic developments created positive feedback loops that reinforced political stability while providing resources for continued military operations. The prosperity that had characterised Oengus's reign and the decades that followed created an illusion of permanence that would be shattered by the appearance of foreign raiders whose maritime capabilities and tactical innovations posed unprecedented challenges to Pictish security. On a summer morning in 795 CE, the monks of Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland watched in horror as strange ships with distinctive square sails and high prows approached their monastery. These vessels, propelled by both wind and oars, carried warriors whose appearance and equipment differed markedly from any enemies the Celtic world had previously encountered. The raiders who disembarked from these longships moved with practiced efficiency. Their round shields, iron helmets, and pattern-welded axes marking them as Scandinavian warriors whose homeland lay far across the North Sea. The success of this initial raid, which netted substantial quantities of silver, religious artefacts, and captives, established a precedent that would transform the political and military landscape of northern Britain. Within months, similar attacks struck monastic centres throughout the Irish Sea region, with Iona suffering a devastating assault in 795 CE that forced the evacuation of many of its treasures to safer locations inland. The speed and coordination of these early Viking operations demonstrated sophisticated naval capabilities and intelligence networks that enabled raiders to identify the most profitable targets while avoiding areas where effective resistance might be encountered. The Viking longships that appeared in Scottish waters during the 790s represented revolutionary advances in maritime technology that gave their crews decisive advantages over existing naval forces in the region. These vessels, typically measuring between 60 and 80 feet in length, combined shallow drafts that enabled them to navigate rivers and coastal shallows with seaworthiness that allowed extended voyages across open ocean. The flexible construction techniques employed in their building, using overlapping planks secured with iron rivets, created hulls that could flex with wave action while maintaining structural integrity under extreme conditions. The tactical advantages provided by these ships extended far beyond simple transportation, as their design enabled operational methods that traditional Celtic warfare could not effectively counter. Viking crews could strike coastal targets without warning, conduct their raids with maximum efficiency, and withdraw to sea before local forces could organise effective responses. The shallow draft of longships allowed raiders to penetrate far inland via river systems, bringing their attacks to communities that had previously considered themselves secure from seaborne assault. The first recorded Viking attack on Pictish territory occurred in 795 CE, when raiders struck the monastery at Iona, though the island's location at the intersection of Pictish, Scottish, and Irish territories makes the precise political affiliation of this target somewhat ambiguous. However, the attack's impact resonated throughout Pictish lands, as Iona had served as a crucial centre of Christian learning and artistic production that maintained close connections with monastic communities across Pictish territories. The raiders' systematic approach to looting revealed detailed knowledge of monastic wealth and organisation, suggesting that these attacks were preceded by careful reconnaissance rather than opportunistic exploration. Archaeological evidence from Iona reveals the extent of destruction caused by Viking raids during this period, with burned buildings and scattered metalwork indicating the thoroughness of the attackers' work. The monastery's scriptorium, which had produced some of the finest illuminated manuscripts in the Celtic world, was abandoned as the surviving monks fled to safer locations, carrying whatever treasures they could transport. The Book of Kells, probably created at Iona during the late 8th century, may have been evacuated to Ireland during this period of instability, preserving one of the masterpieces of Celtic Christian art from Viking destruction. The impact of these early raids extended far beyond their immediate material damage, as the psychological effect of sudden, unpredictable attacks undermined the sense of security that had characterised Pictish territories during the golden age of the 8th century. Coastal communities that had prospered through maritime trade found themselves vulnerable to assault from the same sea routes that had previously brought wealth and cultural exchange. The traditional Pictish emphasis on land-based fortifications proved inadequate against enemies who could strike from unexpected directions before disappearing back to sea. The Pictish response to these new threats revealed both the strengths and limitations of their military organisation as it had developed during the previous century. The royal armies that had achieved such spectacular success against land-based enemies proved poorly adapted to counter seaborne raiders whose operational methods differed fundamentally from traditional Celtic warfare. The heavy infantry formations that had dominated battlefields like Dun Nechtain were too slow to respond effectively to hit-and-run attacks, while the cavalry forces that provided mobility in land campaigns could not pursue enemies who retreated to sea. King Constantine Macfagusa, who ruled the Picts from approximately 789 to 820 CE, inherited these security challenges at a time when internal political pressures were beginning to strain the unity that had characterised Pictish territories during Oengus's reign. The extensive territorial expansion of the previous generation had created administrative burdens that stretched royal resources while incorporating populations whose loyalty to Pictish rule remained questionable. The wealth that had supported earlier military campaigns was increasingly absorbed by the costs of governing expanded territories, leaving fewer resources available for the new defensive requirements created by Viking threats. The succession disputes that emerged during Constantine's reign reflected deeper structural problems within Pictish political organisation that had been masked by earlier military successes. The matrilineal succession system that had provided stability during periods of expansion created complications when territorial losses or military defeats undermined royal prestige. Multiple claimants could advance legitimate genealogical arguments for succession, but their ability to maintain authority depended on demonstrated military success and the continued support of regional nobles whose own positions might be threatened by changing circumstances. The fragmentation of Pictish unity became apparent through archaeological evidence from major royal centres, where construction activities declined significantly during the early 9th century compared to the ambitious building programs of the previous generation. At Burghead, excavations reveal evidence of reduced maintenance and partial abandonment of some defensive structures, suggesting that the resources required for upkeep were no longer available or were being directed toward more pressing military needs. The elaborate timber halls that had symbolised royal wealth and power during the 8th century show signs of hasty repair rather than systematic renovation, indicating the economic pressures that accompanied political instability. The changing nature of warfare imposed by Viking raids required fundamental adaptations in Pictish military organisation and tactical thinking. Traditional Celtic battle formations, designed for confrontations between similarly equipped infantry forces, proved inadequate against enemies who employed different weapons, armour and fighting techniques. Viking warriors typically fought with round shields, single-edged swords or axes, and spears designed for both thrusting and throwing, creating tactical combinations that challenged established Pictish combat methods. The fortification of coastal settlements became an urgent priority as communities attempted to create defences against seaborne assault. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gurness in Orkney reveals hasty modifications to existing structures, with additional walls and defensive features added to provide protection against raiders who might approach from the sea. These improvised defences often incorporated materials salvaged from earlier buildings, indicating the speed with which communities attempted to adapt to changing security conditions. The economic disruption caused by repeated Viking raids undermined the trade networks that had supported Pictish prosperity during the 8th century. Merchants who had previously maintained regular routes between Pictish ports and trading partners across the North Sea found their activities increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. The luxury goods that had flowed into Pictish territories from continental sources became scarce, while the export of Pictish products declined as international commerce adapted to avoid areas where Viking activity made trade hazardous. The social consequences of this economic disruption extended throughout Pictish society, as craft specialists who had depended on long-distance trade for raw materials and markets found their livelihoods threatened. The elaborate metalworking traditions that had produced masterpieces like the St. Ninian's Isle treasure required access to silver, gold, and other precious materials that became increasingly difficult to obtain as trade routes were disrupted. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites shows declining production during the early 9th century, with simpler techniques and local materials replacing the sophisticated methods and exotic materials that had characterized earlier periods. Agricultural communities faced different but equally serious challenges as Viking raids disrupted seasonal activities and threatened food security. The timing of raids often coincided with crucial agricultural periods, forcing farmers to abandon their fields to seek refuge in fortified locations. The loss of livestock and stored grain to raiders created food shortages that persisted long after the immediate danger had passed, while the destruction of agricultural tools and equipment hampered recovery efforts. The political fragmentation that accompanied these economic and social disruptions manifested itself through succession disputes that divided Pictish territories into competing kingdoms, whose rulers prioritized immediate survival over long-term strategic coordination. The death of Constantine MacFagusa around 820 CE triggered a succession crisis that revealed the depth of internal divisions within Pictish society. Multiple claimants advanced genealogical arguments for the throne, but their ability to maintain authority depended increasingly on military support from regional power centres whose own interests might conflict with royal policies. Ingus MacFagusa, who claimed the throne around 820 CE, despite not being the direct heir of the previous king, faced immediate challenges from rival claimants whose supporters controlled significant territories and resources. The civil conflicts that resulted from these disputes further weakened Pictish defences against external threats, while consuming resources that might otherwise have been devoted to military innovation and defensive preparations. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals signs of internal warfare, with burned settlements and weapon deposits indicating conflicts between Pictish factions rather than resistance to foreign invaders. The Viking raids that continued throughout the 820s and 830s exploited these internal divisions, with raiders demonstrating detailed knowledge of Pictish political conditions that enabled them to time their attacks for maximum effectiveness. The coordination required for such operations suggests that Viking forces maintained intelligence networks within Pictish territories, possibly through trading contacts or captured informants who provided information about political developments and military preparations. The gradual shift in power dynamics within Pictish society became apparent through changes in settlement patterns and defensive arrangements that reflected communities' adaptation to persistent external threats. Coastal settlements that had flourished during the peaceful conditions of the 8th century were abandoned or relocated to more defensible inland positions, while new fortifications were constructed at strategic locations that could provide refuge during raids. These defensive adaptations required substantial labour and resources, further straining communities that were already struggling with economic disruption and political instability. The technological innovations that emerged from this period of crisis included improvements in ship design and naval tactics that attempted to counter Viking maritime advantages. Archaeological evidence suggests that Pictish shipbuilders began incorporating features derived from captured Viking vessels, including reinforced construction techniques and improved sail configurations that enhance speed and manoeuvrability. However, these adaptations required time and resources that were often unavailable during periods of active conflict. The religious implications of Viking raids extended beyond simple destruction of monastic centres to encompass fundamental challenges to the Christian worldview that had become integral to Pictish elite culture. The apparent success of pagan raiders against Christian communities raised theological questions about divine protection and the efficacy of Christian practices that had previously provided spiritual comfort and political legitimacy. Some communities responded by intensifying their religious observances, while others began to question the value of maintaining expensive religious institutions that seemed unable to provide effective protection against earthly threats. The artistic traditions that had flourished during the golden age of Pictish civilization showed clear signs of decline during this period of crisis, with stone sculpture becoming less elaborate and metalwork showing reduced technical sophistication. The patronage systems that had supported skilled craftsmen during the 8th century were disrupted by economic instability and political fragmentation, forcing artists to adapt their work to reduced resources and changing market conditions. The symbol stones produced during the early 9th century often show hasty carving and simplified designs that contrast sharply with the elaborate monuments of the previous generation. The administrative systems that had enabled Pictish kings to govern expanded territories during the 8th century proved inadequate to address the complex challenges posed by simultaneous external threats and internal political divisions. The communication networks that had coordinated military operations across vast territories became vulnerable to disruption by Viking raids, while the tribute systems that had funded royal activities were undermined by economic instability and territorial losses. Regional nobles who had previously accepted royal authority began to assert greater independence, creating a decentralized political structure that resembled the fragmented conditions of earlier centuries. The military innovations that emerged from this period of adaptation included new tactical formations designed to counter Viking fighting methods and improve coordination between different types of forces. Pictish commanders began experimenting with combined operations that integrated infantry, cavalry, and naval elements in ways that could respond more effectively to the mobility and unpredictability of Viking raids. These tactical developments required extensive training and coordination that strained military resources while competing with other urgent priorities for royal attention and funding. The convergence of external Viking pressure and internal political fragmentation during the early 9th century created conditions that would ultimately lead to the most significant transformation in Scottish political history. As Pictish kingdoms struggled to maintain their independence against increasingly sophisticated Scandinavian raiders while managing succession disputes that divided their military resources, a figure emerged whose genealogical claims and political acumen would enable him to unite the fractured territories of northern Scotland under a single crown. Kenneth mac Alpin, whose name appears in both Pictish and Scottish king lists, represented the culmination of centuries of intermarriage and diplomatic alliance between the Celtic peoples of Scotland, but his rise to power also marked the beginning of the end for independent Pictish civilization. Kenneth's genealogical credentials reflected the complex marriage networks that had connected Pictish and Scottish royal families for generations. His father, Alpin mac Eochaid, had ruled the Scots of Dalriada during the 830s, while his maternal lineage traced back to Pictish royal families through connections that legitimised his claim to thrones in both kingdoms according to their respective succession laws. This dual heritage positioned Kenneth uniquely to exploit the political instabilities that characterised both Scottish and Pictish territories during the 840s, when military defeats and succession crises had weakened traditional authority structures throughout northern Scotland. The political situation that enabled Kenneth's remarkable achievement had been developing throughout the previous decade, as repeated Viking raids disrupted the economic foundations of both Pictish and Scottish power, while succession disputes fragmented military resistance. The death of Iogannan mac Owain-Gwynedd, who had ruled both Picts and Scots simultaneously since around 837 CE, in a devastating defeat against Viking forces at an unknown location in 839 CE, created a power vacuum that traditional succession mechanisms proved unable to fill effectively. The scale of this disaster, which contemporary sources describe as destroying the flower of Pictish and Scottish nobility, eliminated many of the established leaders who might have provided continuity during the crisis. Archaeological evidence from major Pictish centres during the 840s reveals the extent of political and economic disruption that preceded Kenneth's consolidation of power. At Burghead, excavations show evidence of hasty abandonment during this period, with valuable objects buried in caches that were never recovered, suggesting that the site's inhabitants fled suddenly in the face of immediate threats. The massive fortifications that had protected this royal centre for centuries show signs of deliberate destruction, though whether this resulted from Viking assault or internal conflict remains unclear from the archaeological record alone. The circumstances surrounding Kenneth's initial claim to the Pictish throne, around 843 CE, remain obscured by the partisan nature of later sources, which were compiled after the union had been accomplished and tended to emphasise the legitimacy of Kenneth's rule, while minimising the resistance he encountered. The traditional account preserved in medieval chronicles suggests that Kenneth's accession followed normal succession procedures, with his maternal genealogy providing legitimate claim to Pictish royal authority according to their matrilineal system. However, contemporary evidence suggests that his rise to power involved significant military action and political manoeuvring that overcame substantial opposition from alternative claimants. The integration of Scottish and Pictish territories under Kenneth's rule required careful negotiation between different legal traditions and administrative systems that had developed independently over centuries. The Scottish kingdom of Dalriada had maintained Gaelic legal customs and political structures that emphasise kinship relationships and territorial control through clan networks, while Pictish territories operated according to different principles that emphasised royal authority, exercised through appointed officials and tribute relationships. The successful merger of these systems required compromises that preserved essential elements of both traditions while creating unified governmental structures capable of effective administration. The military challenges that confronted Kenneth throughout his reign required coordination between Scottish and Pictish forces that had previously operated as separate entities, with different tactical traditions and command structures. Scottish warriors typically fought in loose formations that emphasised individual prowess and clan loyalty, while Pictish military organisation had evolved toward more disciplined formations capable of coordinated manoeuvres on large battlefields. The integration of these different military cultures required extensive training and the development of new tactical doctrines that could accommodate both approaches within unified command structures. The continuing Viking threat provided both challenges and opportunities for Kenneth's consolidation efforts, as external pressure created incentives for political unity while simultaneously straining the military resources available for defensive operations. The raiders who had devastated Pictish and Scottish territories during the previous decade continued their activities throughout the 840s and 850s, requiring constant vigilance and rapid response capabilities that tested the effectiveness of Kenneth's unified kingdom. Archaeological evidence from coastal settlements shows continued defensive preparations during this period, with fortifications being strengthened and early warning systems established to provide advance notice of approaching raiders. The religious dimensions of Kenneth's unification efforts involved complex negotiations between different Christian traditions that had developed within Pictish and Scottish territories. The Pictish Church had maintained close connections with Irish monasticism while developing distinctive liturgical practices and artistic traditions, while Scottish Christianity reflected different influences that emphasised different theological emphases and organisational structures. The successful integration of these religious traditions required diplomatic skills and theological sophistication that enabled Kenneth to maintain the support of influential clerical leaders while avoiding conflicts that might undermine political unity. The transfer of religious relics from Iona to Dunkeld during Kenneth's reign represented both practical response to Viking threats and symbolic assertion of unified royal authority over Scottish Christian institutions. The relics of St. Columba, which had been evacuated from Iona due to repeated Viking raids, were established in a new religious centre that could be more effectively defended while serving as a focus for unified Scottish Christian identity. This relocation required substantial resources and careful planning that demonstrated Kenneth's commitment to maintaining Christian institutions while adapting to changed security conditions. Archaeological investigations at Dunkeld have revealed evidence of major construction activities during the mid-9th century that correspond to the establishment of this new religious centre. The scale of building works, which included substantial stone churches and associated monastic buildings, required coordinated labour from across Kenneth's territories, while demonstrating the resources available to support ambitious architectural projects. The artistic programmes visible in surviving architectural fragments show integration of Pictish and Scottish decorative traditions, reflecting the cultural synthesis that characterised Kenneth's unified kingdom. The administrative systems that governed Kenneth's expanded territories required innovations that could accommodate the different legal traditions and social structures that had characterised independent Pictish and Scottish kingdoms. The appointment of regional governors who could represent royal authority while respecting local customs created governmental structures that balanced central control with regional autonomy. These administrative arrangements required individuals with linguistic skills and cultural knowledge that enabled them to operate effectively in diverse political environments while maintaining loyalty to central authority. The economic integration of former Pictish and Scottish territories created opportunities for specialisation and trade that enhanced overall prosperity while strengthening the political bonds that held the unified kingdom together. The establishment of new markets and the standardisation of weights and measures facilitated commerce between regions that had previously maintained separate economic systems. Archaeological evidence from trading centres shows increased activity during the later 9th century, with imported goods and local products indicating the development of more extensive commercial networks than had existed during the period of political fragmentation. The cultural transformation that accompanied political unification involved gradual changes in language, artistic traditions, and social customs that would ultimately eliminate most traces of distinctive Pictish identity. The Gaelic language spoken by Scottish elites began to replace Pictish in official contexts, though the process of linguistic change varied significantly between different regions and social groups. Place names provide evidence of this linguistic transition, with Gaelic elements gradually replacing Pictish terminology in areas that had been solidly within the Pictish cultural sphere during earlier centuries. The artistic traditions that had flourished during the golden age of Pictish civilization showed clear signs of transformation during Kenneth's reign and the decades that followed. Stone sculpture continued to be produced, but the distinctive Pictish symbol systems that had characterized earlier monuments gradually disappeared in favour of purely Christian iconography that reflected the religious preferences of the unified kingdom. The technical quality of carving remained high, but the cultural meanings encoded in earlier artistic programmes were lost as the social context that had supported them ceased to exist. The symbol stones that had served as territorial markers and genealogical records during the height of Pictish power became archaeological curiosities whose meanings were no longer understood by the populations that encountered them. The complex symbolic vocabulary that had enabled these monuments to communicate detailed information about political relationships and religious beliefs was forgotten as the social institutions that had maintained this knowledge were absorbed into different cultural systems. This loss of interpretive knowledge represents one of the most significant cultural casualties of the political unification process. The metalworking traditions that had produced masterpieces like the St. Ninian's Isle treasure continued to operate during the transition period, but their products increasingly reflected the artistic preferences and cultural values of the unified Scottish kingdom rather than distinctively Pictish traditions. The technical skills that had characterised Pictish craftsmen were preserved and transmitted to new generations, but the cultural contexts that had shaped their artistic programmes were gradually replaced by different symbolic systems and aesthetic preferences. The legal traditions that had governed Pictish society underwent systematic transformation as Gaelic legal customs gradually replaced indigenous practices throughout the former Pictish territories. The matrilineal succession system that had characterised Pictish royal families was abandoned in favour of patrilineal inheritance that aligned with Scottish and broader European practices. This change had profound implications for the genealogical claims that had traditionally legitimised political authority, effectively eliminating one of the most distinctive features of Pictish political organisation. The territorial organisation that had characterised independent Pictish kingdoms was restructured according to Scottish administrative principles that emphasised different relationships between central authority and regional power centres. The tribute systems that had connected Pictish royal centres with peripheral territories were replaced by feudal relationships that reflected the influence of European political models. These changes required extensive negotiation and occasional military action to overcome resistance from traditional elites whose positions were threatened by new administrative arrangements. The evidence for resistance to Kenneth's unification efforts remains fragmentary, but archaeological and documentary sources suggest that the process involved significant conflict and coercion rather than peaceful merger of willing partners. Weapon deposits from this period show evidence of internal warfare, while the abandonment of some traditional Pictish centres suggests that political change involved displacement of established elites who refused to accept new authority structures. The systematic nature of these changes indicates that unification required sustained effort over several decades rather than simple proclamation of unified rule. The international recognition that Kenneth's unified kingdom received from neighbouring powers demonstrated the success of his consolidation efforts, while providing diplomatic advantages that strengthened his position against both internal opposition and external threats. Contemporary sources record diplomatic contacts with Frankish and English courts that acknowledge Kenneth as legitimate ruler of a unified Scottish kingdom, providing international legitimacy that reinforced domestic authority. These diplomatic relationships also facilitated access to military technologies and tactical innovations that enhanced defensive capabilities against continuing Viking threats. The legacy of independent Pictish civilization persisted in various forms throughout the territories that had been incorporated into Kenneth's unified kingdom, though the political and cultural institutions that had sustained Pictish identity gradually disappeared. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal the sophistication of Pictish achievements in art, technology and political organisation, while place names preserve linguistic evidence of their distinctive cultural traditions. The symbol stones that dot the Scottish landscape remain as monuments to a civilization whose achievements rivaled those of their better documented neighbours. The preservation of Pictish heritage in modern Scotland reflects both scholarly interest in recovering lost historical knowledge and popular fascination with the mysterious aspects of their civilization. Archaeological investigations continue to reveal new evidence about Pictish society and culture, while efforts to interpret their artistic traditions and understand their political organisation contribute to broader appreciation of early medieval Scottish history. The museums and heritage sites that display Pictish artefacts serve to maintain public awareness of their achievements, while providing educational resources that ensure their legacy continues to inform understanding of Scotland's complex historical development. The transformation of independent Pictish kingdoms into components of a unified Scottish state represents one of the most significant political changes in early medieval European history. The process by which Kenneth MacAlpin achieved this unification demonstrates the complex interplay of genealogical legitimacy, military capability, and diplomatic skill that characterised successful political leadership during this period. The cultural synthesis that resulted from this union created the foundation for the medieval Scottish kingdom that would emerge as a major European power during subsequent centuries, though this achievement came at the cost of eliminating one of the most distinctive civilizations in early medieval Britain. The end of independent Pictish rule around 843 CE marked not simply a change in political leadership, but the conclusion of a unique experiment in early medieval state formation that had produced remarkable achievements in art, technology, and political organisation. The matrilineal succession system, elaborate symbol stone tradition, and sophisticated administrative structures that had characterised Pictish civilization represented alternative approaches to the challenges of governing complex societies that differed significantly from the models that ultimately prevailed. Their absorption into the unified Scottish kingdom eliminated these alternatives while preserving elements that would continue to influence Scottish cultural development for centuries to come.